In Innsbruck, on a street that leads toward the Brenner Pass, there is a building where bronze has been melted continuously for over 400 years. The Grasmayr Bell Foundry was established in 1599, when Bartolomé Grasmayr cast his first bell after an 8-year journeyman apprenticeship under the Aachen bell founder Joan von Thier. 14 generations later, the foundry is still operated by the Grasmayr family. Brothers Johannes and Peter Grasmayr run it today. The furnace is still fired. The molds are still built by hand from clay and loam. The bronze, roughly 4 parts copper to 1 part tin, is still poured from a ladle into molds held together with steel bands. And the bells that emerge from those molds still ship to more than 100 countries. This is not a museum. In July 2026, workers at the foundry cast 12 bells in a single session for churches in Italy, Germany, and Romania. The molds were prepared over weeks. The alloy was melted to approximately 1100 degrees Celsius. The pour was done by artisans wearing protective gear against heat that would burn exposed skin in seconds. When the bells had cooled for a week, the molds were broken open and the founder inspected the castings. "I'm very happy with the casting," Johannes Grasmayr told a reporter, pointing to the precise negative imprint still visible in the clay form. This is the reality of traditional bell founding in the 21st century, a craft that has changed remarkably little in its fundamental process since the 12th century, practiced by a dwindling number of foundries across Europe. Foundries that have survived wars, economic collapse, the Industrial Revolution, and the slow erosion of demand that comes when the world builds fewer churches and the ones that remain can buy mass-produced bells for a fraction of the cost. The question this episode asks is not whether the craft will survive, it is what we lose if it does not. A traditional bell foundry is not merely a place where bells are manufactured. It is a repository of accumulated knowledge. Knowledge that exists partly in documents, partly in the physical tools and molds themselves, and substantially in the hands and habits of the people who work there. During the Renaissance, hundreds of bell makers operated across Europe. Most were small, family-run operations. Many were itinerant, traveling from church to church and casting on site. Over the centuries, as transport improved and permanent workshops became viable, the trade consolidated. By the 19th century, a handful of established foundries dominated the market in each country. In England, the 2 leading firms were the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London, founded in 1570, making it arguably Britain's oldest manufacturing company, and John Taylor and Company in Loughborough, whose lineage traces to a Leicester bell founder named Johannes de Stafford, documented as early as 1338. Each of these foundries developed its own institutional knowledge over centuries: specific alloy ratios, mold building techniques, profile shapes, and tuning methods that produced a house sound, a tonal signature recognizable to anyone who knew bells well. Whitechapel bells sounded different from Taylor bells, which sounded different from Grasmayr bells, which sounded different from the bells of Royal Ijsbouts in the Netherlands or the Packard Foundry in Annecy, France. These differences were not accidental. They were the acoustic expression of centuries of accumulated, closely guarded craft expertise. When a foundry closes, this institutional knowledge does not transfer automatically. Records can be archived, tools can be preserved, but the embodied knowledge, the way a particular founder reads the color of molten bronze, the specific hand pressure used to pack a mold, the intuitive judgment of when the metal is ready to pour, dies with the last practitioner unless it has been passed, by long apprenticeship, to a successor. The core process of bell casting has remained fundamentally unchanged since the 12th century. Theophilus Presbyter would recognize what happens inside the Grasmayr foundry today. The mold is still built in 3 parts. First, the core, a solid clay form shaped to match the interior contour of the bell, constructed in layers, each dried before the next is applied. Over the core, a false bell is shaped from wax or a similar material, reproducing the exact thickness profile the finished bell will have. Over the false bell, the cope, the outer shell, is built from clay reinforced with horsehair or fiber. When the cope is complete and dried, The assembly is heated to melt out the wax, leaving a precise negative space between core and cope. The mold is then secured, and molten bell bronze, heated to approximately 1,100 degrees Celsius, is poured into the space. What has changed is the infrastructure around the process. Modern foundries use gas or electric furnaces rather than charcoal. They have pyrometers to measure temperature rather than relying solely on the color of the melt. Steel bands and mechanical clamps hold the molds together rather than packed earth. The casting pits at Grasmayr are 6 meters deep, capable of accommodating bells weighing up to 37 tons. And the bells, once cast, are tuned on a lathe, a technology unavailable before the 19th century, rather than accepted as cast. But the critical steps, the mold construction, the alloy formulation, the pour itself, and the final acoustic assessment, remain craft processes that depend on human judgment. No machine decides when the bronze is ready. No computer determines the exact moment to pour. The founder watches, listens, and acts. The craft knowledge that governs these decisions is the same knowledge that was transmitted by apprenticeship in the 13th century. It has simply accumulated more refinement along the way. Every foundry guards its alloy. This is not a metaphor. The standard composition of bell metal, approximately 78% copper and 22% tin, has been broadly known for centuries. But within that general framework, each foundry has its own precise recipe, refined over generations. The tin content in bells produced by different historical foundries ranges from roughly 20 to 26%, and that variation is the difference between a bell that sings and one that merely sounds. At Grasmayr, the family's specific alloy formulation and calculation methods are described as closely guarded. The research and development that refines these formulations is conducted within the family, integrating modern acoustic analysis with inherited empirical knowledge. Each generation inherits the previous generation's refinements and adds its own. The physics behind this secrecy is real. Bell metal is a high tin bronze, substantially higher in tin content than tool bronze or statuary bronze. This elevated tin concentration reduces the internal damping of the metal, meaning the bell vibrates longer and more freely when struck. But it also makes the alloy more brittle. A bell with 20% tin behaves differently under stress than one with 24%. The founder must balance sustain against durability, brightness against warmth, and the specific partial tone relationships that define the bell's musical character. Too little tin, and the bell dies quickly, a dull thud rather than a sustained ring. Too much, and the bell becomes fragile, liable to crack under the impact of its own clapper over years of ringing. The optimal point varies depending on the size of the bell, its intended use, and the founder's aesthetic preference. This is why the exact ratio is worth protecting. It is the encoded acoustic judgment of generations, distilled into a number. Modern material science has mapped the phase diagram of copper-tin alloys in exhaustive detail. But knowing the phase diagram and knowing how a specific alloy ratio will behave in a specific mold at a specific pour temperature, accounting for impurities, cooling rate, and the subtle interactions between metal and clay, are entirely different things. The first is science. The second is craft. A bell is not a single note. It is an orchestra compressed into a single piece of bronze. When a well-cast bell is struck, it produces a cluster of partial tones, at least 5 principal partials that together create what the ear perceives as one rich, complex pitch. The hum note sounds an octave below the perceived fundamental. The prime matches the named pitch. The tierce sits a minor third above. The quint sounds a fifth above the prime, and the nominal rings an octave above. A bell with more than 50 detectable harmonics is not unusual. The Grasmayr Foundry describes its bells as producing over 50 harmonics that blend into a single tone. The relationship between these partials determines everything about how a bell sounds, whether it is warm or bright, concordant or clashing, pleasing or harsh, and these relationships are governed by one primary factor: the thickness profile of the bell wall. A bell that is thicker at the waist emphasizes different partials than one thicker at the lip. The exact curvature of the bell's cross-section, its profile, is the founder's principal tool for controlling tone. Before the 19th century, founders had no way to adjust these partials after casting. The bell's tone was determined entirely by the shape of the mold. If the proportions were right, the bell sang. If not, it was melted down. The invention of the tuning lathe, a machine that could shave controlled amounts of metal from the bell's interior, changed this calculation. Founders could now cast a bell slightly overweight and then remove material in precise locations to bring each partial into tune. This was a revolution in bell-making accuracy, but it did not eliminate the need for craft judgment. The tuning lathe corrects, it does not create. A badly cast bell with fundamental structural or alloy problems cannot be tuned into a good one. The casting must be sound, in every sense, before tuning can refine it. On June 12, 2017, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London cast its last bell and closed its doors after nearly 450 years. The foundry had been making bells in London since 1570, longer than the Bank of England has existed, longer than the Palace of Westminster has stood in its current form. It had cast the Liberty Bell in 1752 and Big Ben in 1858, the latter at 13.5 tons, still the largest bell ever produced at the Whitechapel site. Over the centuries, Whitechapel bells had shipped to parishes, cathedrals, and civic buildings across the British Empire and beyond. 500 tower bells in Australia, 600 in the United States, at least 900 in Canada. The closure was not sudden. Demand had been declining for decades. Fewer churches were being built. Those that needed bells could source cheaper alternatives, industrially cast or even electronically simulated. The foundry's Grade 2 listed buildings needed renovation that the business could not fund. When the Hughes family, owners since 1904, decided to sell, the site was purchased by a property developer. The plan was to convert the foundry into a boutique hotel. Campaigns to prevent the conversion failed. Bell casting at the Whitechapel site ended, and with it, an unbroken chain of craft knowledge that stretched back to the Reformation. The patents and production rights were eventually sold separately. Tower bell production moved to other hands. A charitable initiative proposed reviving bell making at the site with Nigel Taylor, who had been Whitechapel's foreman for 40 years. But as of this recording, the buildings sit largely unused. The closure of Whitechapel left John Taylor and Company in Loughborough as the last major bell foundry in Britain, a firm whose own connection to the trade reaches back to 1338. Taylor still casts bells using traditional methods. But the Whitechapel house sound, the specific tonal quality that centuries of refinement had produced, is gone. During the Renaissance, hundreds of bell foundries operated across Europe. Today, depending on how strictly you define a traditional foundry, the number is in the single digits. Grasmayr in Innsbruck, now in its 14th generation. John Taylor in Loughborough, tracing its lineage to 1338. Royal Ijsbouts in Aston, the Netherlands, the last remaining Dutch bell foundry, which absorbed its competitor Petit and Fritzen in 2014. The Picard foundry in Sèvrières, near Annecy, France, whose family connection to bell casting dates to 1796. The Marinelli foundry in Agnone, Italy, which claims continuous operation since the 14th century. A handful of smaller workshops in Germany, France, and Spain. Each of these survivors operates in a market that has contracted drastically. The peak demand for church bells coincided with the great era of church construction, the medieval and early modern periods in Europe, the colonial expansion that carried European Christianity and its bells across the globe. As construction slowed, as existing bells proved durable enough to last centuries without replacement, and as electronic alternatives became available, the demand for new, traditionally cast bells fell to a fraction of what it had been. The foundries that remain have adapted in different ways. Some have diversified into clockmaking, art casting, or restoration work. Royal Ijsbouts, for instance, manufactures both bells and tower clocks, and has conducted extensive research into acoustic optimization. Grasmayr has invested in its museum and visitor experience, making the foundry itself a cultural attraction. Taylor combines traditional casting with modern engineering for bell frames and fittings. But all of them, without exception, still cast bells using the three-part mold process that has defined the craft since the Middle Ages. The mold is still built by hand, the bronze is still poured from a ladle, and the founder still listens to the first ring and knows, by ear, by experience, by the accumulated judgment of generations, whether the bell is true. It is technically possible to produce a bell-shaped object from bronze in a factory setting. Cast it in a permanent steel mold, rather than a disposable clay one. Automate the alloy mixing, pour by machine, skip the weeks of hand mold building. The result will look like a bell, weigh like a bell, and produce a sound when struck. But it will not sound like a traditionally cast bell. And the reason is rooted in physics that industrial methods struggle to replicate. A clay mold breathes. As molten bronze fills the space between core and cope, the clay releases moisture and gas in a controlled manner that allows the metal to settle and solidify uniformly. A permanent steel mold does not breathe. It traps gases differently. It conducts heat differently, changing the cooling rate and therefore the crystal structure of the solidified bronze. These microscopic differences in grain structure affect how the metal vibrates, and vibration is all a bell is. The wall profile of a traditionally cast bell is shaped by hand, using a crook template whose exact curvature reflects generations of accumulated tonal expertise. Industrial bells are cast to standardized profiles that optimize for consistency and cost, not for the specific acoustic character that distinguishes a great bell from a merely adequate one. A handmade mold can incorporate subtle variations in thickness at specific points, variations that a skilled founder uses to adjust the balance of partial tones before the bell is even poured. Then there is tuning. A traditionally cast bell, tuned on a lathe by a trained ear working with acoustic measurement, is adjusted partial by partial until the 5 principal tones achieve a precise relationship. An industrially produced bell may arrive at acceptable pitch, but with partials that are merely close rather than precisely balanced. The difference is audible. Musicians, campanologists, and anyone who has heard a great bell beside an industrial one can hear it. Whether that difference justifies the vastly higher cost and longer production time of traditional casting is a question each buyer must answer. But the acoustic fact is not in dispute. For the foundries that survive, restoration work has become as important as new production, and in some cases more so. Europe's bell heritage is vast. Tens of thousands of tower bells hang in churches across the continent, many of them centuries old. Over time, bells develop problems. Clappers wear grooves in the strike zone, changing the tone. Headstocks crack. Bell frames deteriorate. And bells themselves can develop stress fractures, particularly in areas where repeated impact over centuries has weakened the bronze. The Grasmayr Foundry alone has restored hundreds of defective bells from 12 European countries. The restoration process can involve welding cracks, rebalancing the bell's suspension, replacing worn hardware, and, in some cases, retuning a bell whose partials have drifted as metal has been lost from the strike zone. This work requires the same foundry skills as new casting: knowledge of the alloy, understanding of the bell's geometry, and the acoustic judgment to know what a restored bell should sound like. Restoration also serves as a bridge between eras. When a foundry repairs a bell cast by a different firm 2 or 3 centuries ago, the restorer must understand the original founder's intentions: the profile, the alloy, the tonal target. This requires exactly the kind of deep craft knowledge that industrial production does not develop. A factory that stamps out bells to a standard specification does not produce workers who can diagnose and repair a 14th century casting. For the remaining traditional foundries, restoration is both an economic lifeline and a form of craft continuity. It keeps the furnaces lit, it keeps the apprentices employed, and it ensures that the knowledge needed to work with historic bell bronze, knowledge that no textbook fully captures, remains in living hands. When you walk into a working traditional bell foundry, into the casting hall at Grasmayr or the workshop at Taylor, you are standing inside a continuous chain of transmission that reaches back to the medieval period. The tools on the wall may be modern replacements, but their shapes have not changed. The furnace is newer, but its purpose and its position in the workflow are the same. The clay that lines the molds is sourced from different quarries than a 13th century founder would have used, but it is prepared in the same way. Mixed with horsehair or fiber, applied in thin layers, dried thoroughly between applications. The alloy recipe is written nowhere that an outsider could find it. It is held in the founder's memory, verified by the founder's ear, and passed to the founder's successor only when trust and competence have been demonstrated over years. This is what a traditional foundry preserves. Not just a product, but a process. And not just a process, but a lineage of judgment. The difference between a great bell and a mediocre one is not a formula. It is the 1,000 small decisions that a trained founder makes during casting, each one informed by experience that no manual can substitute. The question facing the remaining foundries is whether this lineage can continue. The economics are difficult. The market is small. Training a bell founder takes years, and the skills, once lost, cannot be reconstructed from books or recordings. A bell can be analyzed spectrally. Its partial tones can be measured to fractions of a hertz. But the knowledge of how to produce that bell, how to build the mold, mix the alloy, time the pour, and read the first ring, that knowledge lives only in the people who practice it. If the last traditional foundries close, the bells they have already cast will continue to ring. Bronze endures. But the ability to make new ones, or to restore the old ones with the understanding that only comes from doing the same work, will be gone. The product survives. The craft does not. The Grasmayr Foundry's 6-meter casting pit can accommodate bells weighing up to 37 tons. One of the largest the brothers have cast, a bell for Romania's National Cathedral in Bucharest, completed in 2016, stands 3 1/3 meters tall and weighs more than 25 metric tons. Another, a 15-ton bell, hangs in a church on Mount Tabor in Israel. These are not museum pieces. They are working instruments, commissioned by communities that chose a traditionally cast bell over an industrial alternative. Every one of those bells was built by hand, from a mold of clay and wax, using an alloy ratio held within the Grasmayr family for 14 generations. Every one was poured in a single irreversible pour, cooled for days, broken from its mold, tuned on a lathe, tested by ear and by instrument, and shipped to a tower where it will ring, if the bronze holds, if the hardware is maintained, for centuries. The founders who do this work today are neither relics nor romantics. They are skilled professionals operating in a competitive global market, producing instruments that are measurably superior in acoustic quality to their mass-produced equivalents. They have integrated modern acoustic measurement, computer-aided design for bell profiles, and pyrometric temperature control into a process that remains, at its core, a handcraft. The foundation has not changed. The additions have made it more precise, not less human. What they cannot do is train enough successors. The economics of the craft, long apprenticeships, small markets, high material costs, work against the scale of reproduction the craft needs to sustain itself. This is the fragility, not a lack of skill, not a lack of quality, not a lack of demand for excellence, but a structural mismatch between the pace at which craft knowledge can be transmitted and the pace at which the market rewards it. The foundries that remain are the living link between the medieval casting pit and the modern tower. They hold knowledge that exists nowhere else, and every bell they cast is a statement that the handmade instrument is not obsolete, that the sound of a bell shaped by human hands and human ears carries a quality that no machine has matched. 14 generations of the Grasmayr family have stood beside the same furnace, reading the color of molten bronze and deciding when to pour. Centuries of the Whitechapel firm cast the bells that marked the hours of London, the independence of a nation, and the opening of a world's Olympics. And then the furnace went cold. At John Taylor in Loughborough, at Royal Icebouts in Aston, At the Marinelli Foundry in Agnone, the chain continues, but it is thinner than it has ever been. What these foundries carry is not merely a method. It is a form of listening, an ear for the difference between bronze that rings and bronze that merely sounds, that took centuries to develop and could take a generation to lose. You will find a subscribe button just below this video. It takes a second to press, and it signals something simple, that the craft of bell making, real, physical, irreplaceable, matters enough to follow. If the science, the history, and the human story behind these foundries interest you, subscribe. And we have 2 questions for you in the comments. Have you ever visited a working bell foundry or heard a traditionally cast bell being rung? What did it sound like? And which foundry, bell, or acoustic tradition should we investigate next?